Okay, I want to welcome anyone that might be watching this later on in a recording. This is a conversation based around a book that we're using for a platform of conversation and reflection this Lent. And I'm going to share now a screen, which is to a PowerPoint presentation that will hopefully make this go forward with lots of good sense. And that's not the one I'm looking for. Goodness. No, let's stop sharing that screen. Pardon me, just a quick second, gang. Sorry. One of these days, I hope to never be adept at this. I don't want to be somebody that knows. Okay, I think we can see that better now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, there.
So, I know we just said mute, but don't, because I really require you guys to be a part of this with me. This is a cover of the book if you've not seen a copy of the book itself. The subtitle, I think, is really important for us, recovering the wisdom of our founders. By no means do I think this is a nostalgic book or one that is an apologetic for for some sort of patriotic and symbolic America. It's something that I think also speaks very poignantly to the Christian ideal. Needleman is a Jewish man and a thoughtful philosopher, but part of what I want us to be able to encompass with him is that he loves runningly into Christianity because he sees at the heart of much of what we do in the world, the Western civilization, and particularly in America, he sees as having been steeped and rooted, even foundationed in Christianity, the Christian ideal. So as a Jewish man, he advocates this. And in such, I think we're going to see some things here that speak to us as Christians, as well as promising and giving us some vision and ways in which we could perhaps be better Americans, but also help us to see a better way to be Americans together. And thinking about some of the things that have been coming out from our diocese about the way they wanted us to conduct this Lent, I think this attacks the very heart of what we need as opposed to particular symptoms. I just want to kind of throw you through here, if you're following in the book. I would like us to be able today to kind of work on the ideal of America and our America. And then you can see here, we're going to read a lot for next week, chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. This idea of percolating up some of these ideas that come from our founding fathers. One of the things he does is he begins by looking at the people that sort of forged America. And today, that's a tough thing to do. The University of Washington in Washington State has a movement amongst the student body to change the name of the university and to remove the statue of George Washington from their campus. We can talk about why that is, but I think that part of what I like about Needleman is it's going to need to raise some ideas for us on why these might be some things we want to hold on to. And again, looking at it from the Christian perspective, are we ready to cancel people because of their failings or see them for their virtues? Because if we're ready to start to cancel people, by the nature of humanity, we may need to throw ourselves into the cancel stack. But going forward, looking down, we're going to look at crimes of America. Now, this is why I say he's not an idealist. He's not just painting a, pun intended, a white, rosy picture of the United States. On the 10th, we'll be looking at what Needleman describes as the crimes of America, looking specifically at the way the Indians were treated in our history and in our present, and slavery as well. Next, we're going to look at this question of how to reconcile two different democracies, the America that we are and the America we can become. And looking forward to what will essentially be our last meeting will be the conclusion of looking into the chapters 11 and 12, which is about, and I'll say more when we get to that point about what the guardian at the door means, and towards a community of conscience. I just want to say a little bit about Needleman. I'm a huge fan. He's actually somebody that I characterize as a spiritual father of mine, and also an intellectual father. He is still sitting out there in the world being a professor of philosophy. His area of expertise is the philosophy of history, which is to say that he looks in history in order to find the great ideas and the great notions that we can use to not only understand our past, but to understand and predict our future. He's brilliant. We see here at Harvard, Yale, and decided to go to Freiburg just to be able to prove that he was smarter than America. And he's done many other things and taught and led in other locations. I'll let you kind of take a look at this. If you've seen him on TV, you probably have seen him with Bill Moyers. PBS loves to put him on a lot of places for the kind of fellow he is, but also because he likes to bring America and he likes to bring our society into an idea of thinking of itself as something more than we are today. So far, how are we doing?
Good.
Okay. Now, this is the first thing I want to do. This is a provocative question. Is America a Christian nation? I pose that question to you. Are we a Christian nation? That's a big topic right now. You've been hearing a lot about Christian nationalism in the news. That was part of what happened on the 6th of January.
Started
I'm going off
out,
mute.
What's
Right.
that?
Started out as a Christian nation.
Okay, I like that.
I don't think so.
No?
The Indians were not Christian.
They were not. No. And there's a
We've
lot.
had immigrants with us almost from the get-go. Jews have been here for nearly our entire history.
Right.
Well, it's a trick question. Because
Wow.
partly what I want to say is, by saying, is it a Christian nation? Obviously, we are not a nation of Christians. And indeed, you don't even have to be an adherent to Christ to be a part of this. But I think one of the interesting things that you'll find with Needleman, and I'm going to try and draw out for us from this, is there's a great deal in the founding and the ideals that were founded with our country that draw heavily upon Christ and Western Christian tradition. Judeo-Christian might be even better to say. Does that make sense? And if we look at that, then part of what this happens is not just a philosophical question, how can we do a better job of being good Americans? It also helps us to think about how we can do a better job of being Christians. Because part of what he's going to say very early on in our conversation today is, what is important about being American? And as such, I want us to take a little bit of pride in our little nation as we go into this. And I start with that question because this is from page 3/4 in the book. He talks about aching questions. The big question he raises for us today is, what is the American soul? Now, this quote here is this: it has been said that any question can lead to truth if it is an aching question. And he defines that as a profound ethical dilemma, a problem involving the whole direction of one's life. Do we find ourselves looking at something and saying, this isn't just an abstract notion of how to do something better or be something better, but actually pulls us in because who and what we are demands from us to ask the question and to find its answer.
PR.
Does that make sense?
I have to go back. I'm in the middle of a Zoom meeting with Father Patrick in the church.
Okay. I'm headed to Anna's birthday, so.
Okay. Talk to you tomorrow.
Love that mute. Okay. So what I wanted to start with is one of the things that we're finding ourselves most upset with in our nation
Sorry.
is this notion of materialism. I like this where it says our world seems, so we see and hear on all sides is drowning in materialism, commercialism, and consumerism. But really what Needleman wants us to reconsider is the root of materialism is a poverty of ideas and about the inner and outer world. Now, this is one of the first places I want to draw out Christianity. Part of what makes us adherents and followers of Christ is easily because we don't want to go to hell. You know, this is what we do. We want to satisfy God in some way so that we find ourselves feeling as if we have a salvific idea. But one of the things that we also do is we want to be better people. We want to come in line with what God wants us to be. And we see ourselves as being drawn into something that's both internal and external, because when we're driven into ourselves and find the answers in God, part of what we have to do is be driven out to him and then out to each other. Many times you've heard me talk about this idea of a vertical and a horizontal relationships, the vertical relationships between us and God, and the horizontal relationships between each other. And this is at the heart of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So he continues here, less and less does our contemporary culture have or even seek commerce with great ideas. And it is that lack that is weakening the human spirit. This is the essence of materialism. Materialism, a disease of the mind, starved for ideas. I'm looking at your faces. I hope this is stirring you. What do you think about that? What does this say to you?
I highlight a lot of things, and that was one of the things I highlight with 2 lines.
Mm-hmm.
Me too.
I thought it was interesting that, the notion of materialism really is the lacking of something, not the acquisition of things. And I thought it was a great definition or articulation of it.
He does a good job, I think, also of trying to help us, so we think of it as Christians, is that we are turned to the spiritual as well as just the material goals of our lives, that without them, something wrong happens to us, which I thought was rather beautiful. One of the quotes here that I also want to lead into next is this idea that there's 2 natures of humanity. And right off the bat, this is at the heart of what Christianity speaks of, the idea that we're both spiritual and physical. Within the vast body of teachings about man in the universal world, several elements stand out as critical for our understanding of the idea of America. One of the most central of these elements is the idea of man as a being who exists between 2 worlds, the inner world of the great spiritual vision and power, and an outer world of material realities and constraint. The word constraint there was one that I had to really scratch my head over for a while. The fact that when we deal in purely the material world, we hear a lot about limits on humanity. When we go to the interior world, we're given an opportunity to see things that speak more to the limitless ability of the human heart and mind, hence the soul, if you will. I think what he does to us then is he tries to describe the nature of freedom, independence, and equality. What are these things that we think of as core realities of being both Americans, but if we think of it as Christians, this is the same thing that we speak of. We think about freedom from the bondage of sin. We talk about an independence that allows us to be fully the people we're meant to be, unconstrained by all the things of this world that would hold us down, and an equality, a brotherhood of humanity that sees all of our good and our ills laid out, and that we all know that before the eyes of God, all of us are equal, and all things we have come from the Lord. So a pride that we might hold on to, for us, tends to come to a leveling as Christians. And he says here again, speaking of a sort of an ubiquitous ancient teachings, freedom is understood as not as the license to obey one's desires, but as obedient submission to a deep inner law. Sounds like church, doesn't it? Independence is understood as the discovery of one's own authentic self, which, although it may seem paradoxical, is also a mirror of the common cosmic selfhood. We find an identity that draws us into community for which we find not just dependence, but also our identities as well, being part of the body of Christ, for instance. Equality is understood as having every human being's right to seek the truth and to be allowed to give his or her light to the common welfare.
Well, that's certainly not the object of the day nowadays when you're talking college campuses, or you dare not say that.
That's true. That's true,
Yeah.
because we're afraid, aren't we?
yeah, absolutely afraid to express yourself and to say what you think and talk about your inner self, and that you're not, if you don't conform to the doxology of theirs, then you're evil.
Yes.
Mhm.
Which is sad, because part of the reason we share
Very
that
sad.
individual insight and give it to the common welfare, you've heard the analogy of the elephant, right? 4 people were examining an elephant, and one says, well, it feels like a bottle brush. Well, he's looking at the tail. And another one says it's a great big piece of burlap, and there's one that's this weird flappy ears, and somebody else like, it's this long skinny thing. And with each and every one of them, the idea of what the elephant is their part of that they understand, perceive, and have. Each one of them would be incomplete without the collective whole. So in a really kind of a beautiful way, this is what it is that we gain by sharing. But you're right, sometimes we're finding ourselves now being driven into silence for fear that what our perspective might be would be interpreted as biased as opposed to perspective. Is that
Right.
fair?
Definitely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be very careful of what you say, because you could be insulting somebody else or making somebody else feel uncomfortable, and you're in trouble.
Gone are the good old days when you were just a jerk and nobody invited you to dinner.
Exactly. And everybody told you to shut up.
Well, we used to have an old saying, I love it in the South, you can pick your friends, but you're stuck with your relatives. But one of the great things about the church is that we're your relatives, you're stuck with us too. C.S. Lewis described going to church as going to a place with a bunch of people you would ordinarily never hang out with, but you do. And it used to be that one of the things we loved about our country was, and I think we celebrated, was we had different perspectives. And if we spoke about them, both John Locke, but also Thomas Jefferson used to laud the idea of the free market of ideas, which was that, he essentially said, pull on your big boy and big girl pants and get out there. And if your idea is good, then present it and argue it and win. And if your idea is bad, be big enough to realize you've been disproven. And if all of us collectively can come to a higher understanding, then we celebrate it. And the sort of suppression of a perspective and opinion was something that we actually started the Revolutionary War about. Jefferson really loved the idea of allowing Baptists in the exclusively Anglican pre-revolutionary Virginia of having the free right to operate, not because he was Baptist, but because he said everybody should be able to espouse their ideas without unfair privilege or support, but also without necessarily suppression of their perspectives.
Seems we've
So,
lost that along
I'm
the
sorry,
way.
go ahead.
It seems we've lost that along the way.
And lo, this is why we're doing this class. I'm
I've
teasing.
noticed a wide chasm.
There is, but if we don't fix it, one of the things that I hope we'll cover today is there's a real danger in that.
Oh, yeah.
I think we all can perceive that.
Well,
So what is
it's-
democracy? To a significant extent, he says, here on pages 9 and 10, democracy in its specifically American form was created to allow men and women to seek their own higher principles within themselves. Now, this is, I get to see the world the way I do. I get to express myself, believe in what I want to, become and espouse what I do. Without that inner meaning, democracy becomes, as Plato and Aristotle pointed out 2,500 years ago, a celebration of disorderly and superficiality. As the rights guaranteed by the Constitution were based on a vision of human nature that calls us to be responsible beings, responsible to something within ourselves that is higher than all too human desires for personal gain and satisfaction, higher than the dictates of the purely theoretical or logical mind, higher than instinctive loyalties to family and tribe. Tribe is a really empowering word right now. We won't call it that. We call it identity. But the groups that we belong to, And this inner calling is something that allows each of us to be free agents from a tribe. But right now, if one thing is true about our fear to express ourselves, is that either by default we are moved to, gravity draws us into, or we choose to belong to a tribe for safety in the public forum.
Yeah, you want to be in an echo chamber.
Exactly. And who sets the tune? It's the places that we turn in our society to find out where and what we believe and what tribe we want to belong to. I tried to say in a sermon week before last, the extent to which there are, and I don't mean to just pick on poor Zuckerberg, but the extent to which things like Facebook utilize algorithms to create tribes, what they euphemistically and sweetly call the digital living room, that draw people together. And the sad thing is to sell to them, to sell them and to sell to them, and thereby to make a cohesive identity, which really, it's sad to think that you've been drawn into by it for a commercial end. You have become a means as
Right.
opposed to an end.
Yeah, we are their providers without
We are
being
their
able to sell
product.
to us and make no money. I mean, that was in the very beginning when Facebook came about. I couldn't figure out how they're going to make money, how they're going to monetize it.
Yeah.
And then exactly that's what they do. Get the tribe and know what to sell to whom.
Exactly. And we go smilingly with our thumbs up buttons the whole time saying, I like it. And then when you're forced to bump into somebody in the real world, so to speak, one finds oneself wondering where all this cacophony came from.
True.
So what about great ideas? This is something that he drew out that I thought was poignant. This is the mark of great ideas. They unify people, and they also act to unify the disparate parts of the human being as an individual. They speak of a social order that is possible on the basis of an ordering within the individual self. Paradoxical tension that it's supposed to not only bring society together, but it brings together us inside of ourselves with our conflicted elements.
But great ideas are a great danger to them because that predates us. And anything that predates us, any idea that predates us, is dangerous because it's dead women, men and women.
Yes. And that's not a joke, is it? I mean,
No.
and is it, we're now dealing with, instead of universal truths, we are now dealing with subjective
Right.
truths.
Right.
Going forward, then who are our heroes and why should we buy? You mentioned the old dead people. He says here, at the same time with the heroes we learned about as children, Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, once they stood as symbols incarnating the ideas of America, they lived their lives amid the same forces and obstructions within which every human being must find his or her way through life. But we regarded them as heroes because they also lived and acted in relation to something that transcends and transforms the human condition. Each had his weaknesses, his defeats, his doubts, but in each of them, another and greater force existed that expressed itself as the idea of America. In this, they were heroes in the ancient sense of the term. They were demigods.
Oh.
Now, that's a word that makes us cringe, right?
Yeah.
What does that mean? Demigods, that makes it sound like we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, like Zeus, or perhaps like Hercules, at least, had a god daddy and a human mother, perhaps. But that's not where he's really going. What he's saying here is he's talking about myths, mythical heroes. And in it, what he says here, in many ancient mythical traditions, the hero is a demigod, a symbol of a man as a two-natured being, the juxtaposition of the eternal and the finite. George Washington had fake teeth. You know, it's rather sad to imagine. I've seen them, by the way. It's quite something if you've been to Mount Vernon.
I've seen them too.
Now, here's one for you. His fake teeth also included some human teeth.
Ooh.
Some of those human teeth were his slaves' teeth.
Were they pulled?
They were paid for. The question was asked is, were they pulled? The answer is that they were, the slaves were remunerated an amount for their teeth. It was voluntarily given. It was not uncommon for young people to make a tidy sum by allowing healthy teeth to be pulled. You were going to lose them by 30 anyway. So you would take your young healthy teeth and sell them and get a tidy sum for it.
And
Now
thus began the tooth fairy.
Yes, yeah, the precursor of the tooth fairy. Here, let your
Whole
tooth
nother
is out.
level.
But part of what this shows us is not only that they were human, but there's some things there now that we're rather upset about. That's the human side. But you know, as I said in an All Saints sermon this year, one of the things we have to also remember, I love this little story about George Washington. When the Revolutionary War was over and he stood down the Continental Army, George III in England didn't believe he had done it. When the prime minister came and said, yes, he stood down the army and they're having elections, he said, that's impossible. And when they confirmed that he had, he said, well, if he has, then he's the greatest man that's ever lived, that someone who at the head of an army, having kicked us out, doesn't now ensconce himself as king. That's incredible. Napoleon did not do that. Many liberating generals just kept their armies going and made themselves, if not kings, certainly emperors.
Yep.
Augustus Caesar, others like them. So there's these two sides, the man that gladly laid down his arms, the man that set the principle of 2 terms at the most as a president, was somebody that said, I need to get out of here before too long goes by. And someone who would have freed his slaves, except it was against the law in Virginia, and they didn't actually belong to him. They belonged to his estate. He was unable to free them. But he freed everyone he could, and he made provisions that when the law would change, that each of the slaves would be freed only after they had been fully educated and provided with enough funds to be able to become independent. Two sides to this man. So it says here, but it's difficult to hold these two opposite aspects of human nature together in one's mind. So we might flip over to the idealized Washington and say, what a great guy he was. Oh, founder of the country, all that, but forget some of the negative sides that we have to hold in tension with him. Or we might do what is seemingly an ascendancy today, like I mentioned at the University of Washington, and see him only in his negative clay-footed aspects, and then lose all the positive aspects and the symbols that he offered us. Do you see? And so he says here in a quote unquote realism, we have lost the ability to understand that a hero is representation of an idea. So what have we lost by only looking at the all too human Washington? Is first of all, not just being charitable and ignoring the good things he offers, but we're also left, I think, very unfortunately, without the symbol and the idea that he can represent. The idea of being a leader that gives up power. I know in recent weeks, that seems like recent months and things, that's been a hot button topic. Can we have a time in our society? We used to, that peaceful transition of power is something that we readily recognize from George Washington, literally at the head of an army, peacefully transitioning power in the sense of the ability to decide who's in charge, down to the Continental Congress and away from the generalissimo in charge of his army. It's a thought for us to imagine that people, when we say demigod, we don't elevate them to a godly status. What we do is we imbue and take out of them the symbolism they offer us, the heroic symbolism they give, that it conforms to the better angels of our nature, to quote Lincoln, while at the same time allowing ourselves to see in them things that we can emulate because of the all too human failings and inadequacies they carry.
So then should we be getting rid of all these statues?
You know, it's an interesting thing. Two things I want to say about that. Let me mention one that is not liked right now in Washington. It actually has a guard. There is Lincoln the Emancipator. I forget the square it is in, but it's a picture of obviously recently freed African-American slaves coming forward to thank Lincoln for emancipating them.
And then kneeling, yeah.
It was erected primarily from funds from liberated slaves. It's not liked because it looks very paternalistic. When it was dedicated, it's an interesting tale to read. There were a lot of people that got up and said glowing things about Lincoln. One person that got up was Frederick Douglass, the African-American runaway slave who himself, gosh, he would be a fun person just to talk about from history and religion. So much to say about him. I can't do it. But let me say this much. He stood up. He adored, at times he thought he frustrated living daylights out of him. I'll never forget, it was actually just a couple of days before Lincoln was assassinated. There was a large reception for the capitulation of the Army of Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee. And people were coming to a special reception at the White House. And Frederick Douglass appeared at the door, and the guard would not let him in because he was African-American. And he said, "Do you know who I am?" And he goes, "Well, it doesn't matter. We've never let an African-American inside the White House." So he said, "Please let the president know." And the guy wouldn't do it. And finally, he saw somebody behind him he recognized, got him over and said, "Tell the president they won't let me in." A moment later, the gentleman who was a congressman came back and said, "The president said let him in." Well, he came in, and the instant he walked into the reception room, large line of people waiting. Lincoln stopped everything, walked over and said, "This is my friend, Frederick Douglass. Thank you for coming to my home tonight." Shook his hand, chatted with him to the point that even Douglass began to say, "There's hundreds of people here, sir. I need to let you go so you can go back to your receiving line and greet them all." And when he came out of that reception, even before Lincoln was assassinated, he told a friend, "He treated me as an equal, not as a guest, not as a political figure, not as an abolitionist. That man treated me as an equal, and he's the greatest man I've ever known." And when Douglass got up to speak at the dedication of that statue, Lincoln the Emancipator, he said, "The man represented here is the ideal that we have yet to live up to." This is during the Grant administration. And he said that we have not yet made people angry. This is supposed to be a celebration of the achievement of Lincoln. And he said, "Yeah, Lincoln, he did it. You guys, we haven't gotten there yet." And I think that, do we tear down those statues? That's a history about that statue that I think deserves being celebrated and understood. Yeah, it's an interesting question for us to imagine Andrew Jackson in Lafayette Square. How do we reconcile these two things is part of why this book is so important, in my opinion. Because what it walks us through is looking our sins, our crimes right in the eye, and understanding that to those is the symbolic and the idealistic elements that everybody, these people that we think of, carried, coupled with an understanding them at the same time with their all too human and sinful realizations, and looking at them from what we can learn from, both as a positive and as a negative. And that's what it is. Again, I keep pointing this back over. Being a Christian is acknowledging in our own lives, each and all of our lives and each other, that there is the redeemed part of us. And there's the filthy sinner still huffing and puffing inside there.
Right.
And when we look inside ourselves and we look at each other, to appreciate that what God has begun in us, what we celebrate, and at the same time to love and to help redeem the sin inside of us. That it was one of the, I think, the most God blessed sermons I gave at All Saints this year, because one of the most important things we can do is to not look with the eyes of Satan at people, because that is the eye of the accuser. That's what the word Satan means, the accuser. The Redeemer, when we look at people through the eyes of God, we see that more times than not, the very failing thing that we think would cancel someone is the very thing that God can redeem and make their greatest virtue. St. Paul was a dogged chaser and persecutor of the church until God knocked him off his horse on the road to Damascus. And then he used that same zealous energy to become the greatest spreader of Christianity in its history. But we've got to hold those two realities together. And St. Paul never let go of his sinful self. He talked about the thorn in his side that never got better. And he said, that's only there so I'm reminded that it's not me, but God that works through me.
I don't think we should get rid of those monuments and so forth.
But there are some that should be gotten rid of.
And their history should show that, yes.
I mean, there are some that were constructed, well, it's a whole other conversation, but, you know, I think some of the monuments were put up post-Reconstruction specifically to idealize things that, not that we should forget them, but they're not cause for celebration, or it's not part of the American ideal.
And let me just say one thing about that. Post-Reconstruction, this is an interesting reality. In the years after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, tremendous amounts of public funds were exercised for the construction of cemeteries. People had been buried in mass in battles of the Civil War. And so they were reinterred in orderly fashions. You've seen the Gardens of Stone, if you've seen Arlington and things, row upon row of beautifully arranged stones. War memorials and statues and all were built, again, at public expense. For the North only. No such things were done in the South. It was private funds in the South. And you're right, post Reconstruction.
Reconstruction, Jim Crow, that is when many of those were done.
But you can see a different perspective. From another perspective, using private funds, a lot of these organizations were reinterring their dead and building monuments to folks that had been left in mass graves. So you're right, because there are a lot that came later that were about glorification of Jim Crow. There were some terrifying ones that were right outside the New Orleans Aquarium. Was one that commemorated a raid on freed African Americans in the 1890s that was lauding the massacre of these African Americans. That one has been rightly taken down and thrown away.
Definitely that. But I was watching the hearings yesterday with Merrick Garland, and one thing he said was he could see a line from the Oklahoma City bombing straight to January 6th. But he can also see a line from the Oklahoma City bombing straight back to Jim Crow and Reconstruction and so forth and so on. And that kind of just hit me. You know, I mean, it's not over by any stretch.
And one of the things we learn in reconciliation, my dream for St. John's is to link us up with Coventry Cathedral in England. At the close of it, very briefly, beautiful story, and I want you to see where I'm coming from. They bombed Coventry Cathedral when they destroyed Coventry, which was a mill town. And if you go, On the day afterwards, somebody had gone in and taken 2 of the burned embers that were across and put it behind the altar, and in charcoal wrote the words, "Father, forgive." And right after the war, when we were still kind of trying to figure out with denazification and what to do, Coventry linked up with the cathedral in Dresden, which had been carpet bombed by the United States and Britain, bombed from one end to the other, nothing left. And they started a movement of reconciliation between the 2 warring parties. And since then, this group called the Cross of Nails has become an international movement for reconciliation and peace in the world. And I'd love for us to be able to link up with them and to learn from them, but also to help them, to help us to find ways of seeing reconciliation, because we begin by saying we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Because so many of the things that believe me, Nichols and the Oklahoma bombing, horrible thing. But the fact that that spoke to somebody from some perspective, however twisted and evil, still comes from a perspective of somebody that was just feeling a loss. Can we reconcile with them? Can we? And I believe Christianity is something where we look at somebody like St. Paul, who was killing Christians, who was there to incite the murder of the first martyr, St. Stephen. And there's still someone there that can be reconciled. Give it a shot. It works, I promise. It is one of the teachings, he continues here, of wisdom, that the merely logical mind, when it is cut off from the intrinsically higher human feelings of wonder and a sense of the sacred, inevitably becomes the plaything of the external senses, convincing us that only what is perceived with these outward direct senses is real. In the world of Christianity, in the world of these ideas that Needleman is talking about, enemies can become friends. It can happen. There can be a reconciliation between Native Americans and the immigrants that we are. So he says, this paradox, the mythical world does not exclude the world of concrete everyday realities, but includes in it a greater awareness of the paradox of human existence. Do we have so many symbols and sources of mythical power in our primary consciousness, primal consciousness, that we can afford to eviscerate these American meanings that are already there waiting to help us? And I love this one line: we need to re-mythologize the idea of America.
Good.
You know, one of the things that we believe happened, and I love this, it's something that I think is so powerful about Appomattox. If you've ever heard the accounts of the surrender of Robert E. Lee and the Confederate forces of the Northern Army of Northern Virginia, they were driven into desperation. It was starvation that made them quit. The last campaigns of the Civil War was Lee desperately following rumors of where he could find food for his men. And when the last hope they had ran out, they had to give up. And both Lincoln and Grant offered, essentially, if you'll lay down your arms and promise to not take them up again, you can go home and you can keep your horses, and the officers can keep their sidearms because they need to have those to plow. And it's a touching thing to imagine that when Lee came out, the Union Army stood to attention and saluted. Can we afford to do that? Now, these were men of honor, even if they were on opposite sides of a war. But the way they treated each other showed brothers instead of enemies, even though they had just come from heated battles. Can we afford to do that ourselves? Can we use their example? And it's because they believed there was something more between them than just the war, even the real war they had just fought. And the casualties were appalling. And this is something that I think helps us a little bit. I wanted to kind of build up to this part. he talks about there being two kinds of history. He says, in the great sweep of world events over the centuries, what we call history is mainly, as modern observers have termed it, the history of crime.
Mhm.
Who are the bad people and who are the good people that went and made them stop?
Well, history is written by the winners, isn't it?
True. And in some ways, what you can then say is that the crime is defined by the winner, isn't it?
Yep.
Who's the good guy in, excuse me, in 1942 or 1930 or 1940 Europe is the Nazis, because they said, look, we've set all the chaos of Western Europe to naught, and now we've got stability again. We've righted the crimes of Versailles.
Well,
It
Russia
got changed by 1945, didn't it?
Yeah. I mean, Russia kept the world stable too.
It did, at least they're part of it, yes.
Yeah.
And they certainly rewrote that. God bless us when we were able to, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact.
Yep.
Is there a higher calling that we can look to? So there's this second history he refers to
Ability.
that flows from the efforts of more inwardly developed men and women to introduce truth and wisdom into the life of humanity. Now, this is interesting. The proper meaning of the word civilization refers to these efforts and their results. What he's saying is the things that we use that come out of our society that speak not just to who won, but what's right and what's beautiful. He says such ideas come into the world not only in the form of philosophical teachings, but also in the form of religions, science, art, music, painting, sculpture, dance, architecture, myth, and story. We can challenge ourselves to believe that slavery was wrong because we looked critically, but also admiringly at George Washington. And that was available to Virginians who put him on their state seal. But we didn't listen. I say we, I've never been a Virginian. I am free and clear on that, Mark. So this idea of two histories. No civilization can long endure or justify itself unless it allows these two currents of history to exist. One that moves outward towards the life of action and reaction in the outer world, and one that flows inward towards the endless source of consciousness and being. He says, the real hope of America has always been that at the heart of its promises of liberty, equality, and social opportunity, there was sounded the call and the possibility of the search for the sacred within oneself. Whatever name or whatever God or power or mind or conscience has been chosen to designate that sacred reality. He's arguing that there are things that are common to all of us that should unite us. I think that's exciting. And he tries to say there's truth with myth. But even the distant but real reflection of wisdom throws dazzling light on the disappointments, the mistakes, the failures, and even the crimes of America. Wisdom teaches, he says, and ordinary experience easily confirms that the train of events in human history brings forward violence, injustice, and the betrayal of truth, just as much as it may bring forth great external achievements. Wisdom teaches us to be neither foolishly discouraged by Americans' failings, nor foolishly enthusiastic about its stated ideals. Again, that two-sided idea of history and the two-sided elements of people becomes the two-sided understandings of where we've come from and where we go. And again, this is very much a Christian idea. How frustrating is it if we measured our individual and our collective successes as people of God on strictly a bar graph or a line graph that shows our continued perfection towards holiness? We would be very unhappy with ourselves, and we would think that we were a failing venture. I've heard it said very recently that the true measure of a human of the perfection and the continued success of Christianity is not that we are collectively getting better, but amongst all of our frustrations and failures, we every single morning seem to get up and try again. It is the testimony of our faith in God that not that we think that we actually believe today we're going to be different. It's the belief that today God will give me the power to be better. And it's up to me to try and use it. And then thank God he will forgive me, and tomorrow will come and we start again. So this idea of studying that wisdom, what do we do with it? It is possible in the midst of this life of self-betrayal for a transforming force to enter and to lead men and women towards a new kind of life. But this possibility demands the working towards together of communities of individuals who are intensely devoted to the work of studying and understanding the teaching of wisdom. And in many ways, it's the wisdom of our country. It's not enough, I think, to simply take a knee. And I'm not saying that's what some of these people have done. I think what's important is to take the knee and then to preach, teach, and help people to move towards the better goals. If you see my metaphor about the national anthem, I don't know if that take a knee thing. With my kids watching football, we talk about that plenty. And so what? What is, according to Needleman, the hope of democracy and America? He says that it is, he knows the hope of democracy we know is that it allows and to a certain extent calls us towards a life of conscience, a respect for one's neighbors, even the ones and especially the ones we disagree with. That's Patrick. That is rooted in the teachings of wisdom about the actual and potential selfhood of humanity. Each and every person we meet can be their better angels. And again, that's just right out of the gospel. The hope of America lies not in the first history, the history of its crimes, but in the reality of its potential in its ideals, in its second history. We can't just live with the myth. We can't just live with the all too objective, cold definition of what is good and evil. We have to put them together and see them in our past, in our present, in ourselves, and in our future. And again, this is right out of the Christian ideal. It's how we walk in this world as Christians. What is the way forward for Needleman? America, he says, needs to rediscover its mythical dimension. If not, if it begins to live only in its first history, which we're in right now, I think, this book was written years ago, only the outer dimension, it will have lost all that really nourishes the life of a nation or an individual. It will be an outer empire alone, an empire only of money or military power or empty promises. And such an empty empire will soon die. And to the extent that the world is still places its hope in America, the world may die with us. It puts a lot of onus on us at this point, I think. A responsibility. I don't think we can complete this without spending just a moment looking at his idea of the counterpoint, this idea of independence and individualism. Self-determination as an inner ideal means that the voluntary submission of the physical and social conditioned aspects of human nature to the interior power of conscious selfhood. I love this idea that we part of being ourselves is to turn towards the higher good. Authentic individuality means freedom from individualism, which is just what I want. Authentic independence, however, on an individual and communal basis means, among other things, the invitation to love and serve the common good under freely a chosen obedience to a higher law. Needleman says it's God. And I do too. And so does the gospel, which this sounds a whole lot like, doesn't it? The rule of law is the king of America, so says the early founding fathers. I love his little summary here. Government is the realm of legality, society is the realm of ethics, and law is the guardian of conscience. What keeps us from doing something is maybe the fear of law, the fear of consequences of the law, but it keeps us true to our conscience if our laws speak to our conscience. I love this one quote that I think is one of the great takeaway lines of the whole book. The litigiousness of our culture is a clear sign that the legal is usurping the role of the ethical. I think this is one of those huge grains of at the core of the gravity of his thinking. He talks about us needing to work. Understanding our lives is not given to us for ourselves alone, and that human beings would be granted a certain greatness only to the extent that they sought to be able to serve God and their neighbor. My goodness, that sounds like the gospel. An activity without the recognition of grace was practically the definition of the sin of pride. I'm doing what I want to because it's me, because I'm smart, because it's my profit. And I think to kind of pull us around a little bit, he talks also about the freedom of speech, which is something we value. We've talked about here already. You know, are we losing our freedom of speech, or are we demanding that our freedom of speech supersedes anyone else's? He says here, we are losing the knowledge function of the community, that the hard work of thinking together is being eclipsed by the addiction to information and empty verbal or electronic conversation. There's that echo chamber, Peter. And by our society's attachment to applications of knowledge that bring only egotistic and other illusionary gain. And so we loop back around. And he says, the American soul, what is it? It is this goal of bringing people together under the guidance of conscience that lies at the heart of the idea of democracy in its uniquely human form. These fragments, which comprise the basis of the American philosophy, are infinitely precious because they are all that many of us have to show us the direction back towards the real meaning of human life in this desperately troubled modern world. Which sounds, again, a whole lot like the gospel. But what he's saying is, why not let there be a universal national idealism that can draw us back? That can be the roadmap for us to find our way back to this unity that we seem to have lost. So those were the high salient points that I thought were worth drawing out. What did you guys think about this little overview?
Excellent, really excellent.
Did I miss anything that any of you that dug into the book a bit may have seen?
I hadn't read the book, but it strikes a chord because that's exactly where we are. That's sort of the responsibility of conscience, and the guidance of conscience is not what is happening now. It's all individual,
Yep. It's
and
me.
celebrating the individual.
Yep.
I think we can make it. I think we can
Yeah.
make it, but it will require us to create some charity. Hopefully you'll see why I chose this particular course for our Lenten study. I think it's something that drives us back to what it means to be Christians, while also suggesting something that lives, I think, very much hopefully to the spirit of what our bishop and our diocese has asked us to do during Lent, which is to look at ourselves as a culture and society and see what it is that we might be able to do to better rediscover how to be not just church, but our country. I began with the question, are we a Christian country? And I think that I even convinced myself before I went into this that I would say that's not a fair assessment. It also negates our author's perspective of Judaism. I think it's fair to say we are a Judeo-Christian society.
Judeo-Christian society.
But I think at the same time, it's a Judeo-Christian society that acknowledges in its ethic that there's room for everyone who's willing to come into this society, not just to get what they want, but to look for the higher goods that serve all of us and not just this small part of the world that we call us, me, my tribe. How was this tonight? Was it worth you all's time?
Yeah, that was great.
Oh, yeah.
I really enjoyed it.
Give me feedback if you'd like to do it differently. I always want to assume that people, especially this is fairly heady stuff. I don't want you to feel like if you haven't read the book, you can't come or it's not worth your time. And recording it does allow us to be able to put it out for others that may not have been able to mesh with this time frame.
No,
But I bless you all and thank you here and there for being here with us.
I have
And
a question at the
thank
end,
you.
Patrick.
Sure.
It has nothing to do with anything. Continue.
okay, Pat, what's up?
No, continue the conversations. This is
Okay,
the-
where will the recording be?
If I'm lucky, and I've never done this before, so cross your fingers. If I'm lucky, it will be on YouTube and on my channel on YouTube and on Facebook.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I think my sister would enjoy this.
Thank you. And what I want to just say about all this is help me to fine tune it. When I got in there, I'll tell you, I don't do Zoom as a worship direction. I hope he doesn't hear this. There's a priest in our diocese. Whenever we do worship with our diocesan clergy, they always mute everybody. And this guy seems like he purposely unmutes himself so that he can talk during the worship, and it's heinous. So I kind of question whether we can do evening prayer together without it seeming like me just doing evening prayer and you guys witnessing me. But I love being able to have a moment to chat with each other while we're sitting down and having our food. And I look forward to us seeing each other's faces. And we'll look forward to next week, but help me with any comments you would make to refine this and make it better, guys.
It was great.
Thank you.
Very good.
Patrick,
Yes.
Ellen, dinner was wonderful. The soup was.
One quick,
Oh,
Oh.
yeah. Soup is delicious.
Yes, let's hear.
thank you, Ellen. Yes, Ellen and Jeannie McKenzie, God bless you and thank you. What a question was asked here, is it possible for us to have some questions prepared? The answer is you bet, yeah. I kind of try to do that along there, but I think what I'm going to do is compress down some of the review. And if I could come up with some thoughtful questions, if you all have any, we'll include those as well, but some that will foster more dialogue. I think that's better than me being pedantic.
Patrick, the sad part though is that, it resonates with us. I mean, we're educated, 40 years ago and 30 years ago. Unfortunately, it does not resonate with who's being people educated today in college or high school.
I'll tell you something. My children are absolutely bananas with what's happening. Yeah, they call it wokery.
Yeah.
The great awakening is what Will, Seth, and John, my three oldest children, are right there with you, Peter. And I mean that. So part of what they can't abide is what they think is hypocrisy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's a great pendulum swing that we're seeing in our house.
Deborah's saying she's seeing a great pendulum swing in our house. My two oldest sons are leaving the Episcopal Church because they think it's too liberal. They've become Roman Catholic.
Oh, my goodness.
So Peter, I'm not quite so sure that that's true. I think at least in the Edwards household, we're keeping the flames alive.
Well, they have you as a professor.
Yeah.
And, and there's a big difference of you as a professor and a typical professor at Harvard or Amherst.
I take that as a compliment. I bless you.
Well,
You should.
Maybe the bar is not high. I don't mean it that way.
Well, I'm proud to say that I've gotten two of my sons to read God and Man at Yale, which I think is a benchmark, but we'll leave that for another time. But no, so I hope you're enjoying Needleman. If anyone needs a book, let me know. I may try sometime to sneak out on the internet. If you look around, you may find it. I've got a really good interview with him that I might try and see if we can put out there, or I'll play sometime.
Good.
Let me ask one more thing. How do you like this forum of at least getting together? I've got here a few folks that are willing to brave breathing my air. And as you all get inoculated, if you get your shots and things, I do invite you to come and be a part of us here if you feel safe. You know, I said at the annual meeting, the theme for 2021 is back to church.
Right.
And, you know, we've been talking and wanting to do some popcorn theologies, and, you know, we've got the ability to, what's
Yeah.
that? Movie nights coming back. That's right. So,
And
you know,
and
we're
we
going
didn't
to
know that
try
was
and
an
make this
option.
available here online, as well as just to try and see if we can bridge these gaps. So I'm going to keep that promise. We're coming back to church.
Good. No,
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Any Pat, is there
Great,
something
thank
you wanted to touch on?
No, I thought you touched all the 5 senses.
Okay. Well, you know, one tries. How about you, Miss Griffith? You look like you had something.
It had nothing to do with any of this. It's a
Okay.
computer question.
Okay. Well, I'm on
For
the
you.
FYC.
Do you happen to have a USB to USB cord?
Yes, I'm using 2 of them right now.
I figured you probably did. May I borrow one? Can I come over tomorrow and pick it
You
up?
certainly may. I will make it available to you, of
I
course.
won't bore anybody with the issues, but
Well, I've got gifts such as
Now we're curious.
that. If you've
well,
got
I bought a new laptop and I'm trying to transfer. I can't do it through the internet.
I'm
And I
your guy.
bought a cord, but it won't pick it up. So I think the cord's no good.
Well, let me send you guys off with God's blessings tonight. Father, Son, and Holy
Okay.
Spirit, thank you for being with us. I'm grateful, and good night, everyone.
Thank
you.
you. Good night,
Good
everyone.
Good night. Good night.
Right.
Hey, for everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.